guys. This is episode number 14, and we'll be discussing men and their inherent violence. So the order we're going to go with, we're first off going to hand over to Tim, who's going to be discussing primates and violence, specifically male violence.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. As Simon has stated, I'm going to be talking a little bit about primates and humans as primates and how violence exists within different biological sexes in those primate species. A lot of this is based upon the work of a guy, Robert Sapolsky. He's a endocrinologist, and also a biologist who does a lot of study of the behavior of apes. Along with their neurobiology, and in some regards can be sort of thought of as one of the real sort of pioneers of neural behaviorology in primate studies. So one of his really interesting lecture series, which talks about biology and being human, he discusses the difference between different species of primates, and the two archetypical species that he discusses are owl monkeys on one hand, and then on the other hand, he discusses those creatures called baboons. So baboons and owl monkeys. Now, with regards to baboons, he describes them as what we call attorney species. So what happens is you have very violent males who physiologically are quite different from their female kin. So they have, they're extremely large by comparison. Their skulls are much thicker and shaped in a different manner to take blows. They have excessive musculature, and they also have quite large fangs. In comparison, female baboons are much smaller and are much less prone to violence than their male competitors and companions. Now, with regards to owl monkeys, you have males who are much smaller and similar, almost biologically indistinguishable except for the genitalia, from the female monkeys. Now, he calls them a monogamous species as opposed to a tourney species. And the reason why he says this is because what ends up happening in a tourney-style species, like the baboons, is that 1% of males represent around about 95% of the genetic stock. So basically, the most strong and the most vicious male baboons in this case will take control of a harem of a large number of females, will mate with all these females, and then they will ensure that their progeny go on to survive, while the vast majority of male baboons are actually just thrown to the outside, become outcasts, and a lot of them end up just dying and not passing on their genetic material. On the other hand, with the owl monkeys, what happens is that the monkeys have been selected for their ability to, and because they're monogamous and because they are quite similar to the female monkeys, they've been selected on the basis of their ability to provide nurturing and care, and their ability to act as another mother, basically, to support the raising of young. And so really we see two different directions in terms of selection, where for one, it's about the ability of the male to overcome and ensure that his seed is the one that's actually being procreated, and as such there is a very limited incentive for the male baboon to be involved in the caring and nurturing process, while in the other, with the owl monkey, we see there's actually been selection towards the ability of a monkey pair to work together to raise a child and ensure its success. I've got a little bit more to go, but I'll throw to Sam because he does have a question.
Curious to see if you've come across in your study. So if, say, one male baboon is contributing, say, 95%, I think was what you said, of the genetic material, does that mean they're incredibly limited in terms of adapting to other pressures? Just as I pull up climate change as a common one. So say the better suited for climate change baboon is actually a smaller baboon, they will struggle then because the bigger baboon's still going to procreate more. So if, the aggressiveness is the primary driver, has it been shown that they're at a disadvantage compared to other primates in terms of response to environmental stimuli?
So I would say, firstly, that when it comes to just the vagaries of fortune, the way that baboons and other turney-style species have evolved result in that sort of 95%, winner-takes-all kind of evolutionary posture there. And I would agree, it probably would result in a much less variable genetic stock within the baboon population. The other thing, I suppose, that's interesting, though, is actually Robert Sapolsky actually mentioned this in one of his studies. There was one incident where a bunch of these monkeys, I keep saying the wrong one, baboons, were actually living at a trash pile, which was near one of the resorts in Kenya where he was doing these studies. And what happened was they basically had become super strong and super dominant because they controlled a pretty regular supply of food because of all the stuff that's being thrown out in the trash. And what happened was you actually had a case of tuberculosis, which was traced back to the food being dumped in this pile, go through the baboon population that was in control of that particular trash pile. And what they found was that the baboons that all died from the tuberculosis were the strongest, biggest, and meanest, who actually had control and dominance over the baboon troop. And what ended up happening is that with the baboons, once they'd had all this, like the top, I would say, apex sort of members of the group have been wiped out because they were the ones that were monopolizing access to that trash pile, you actually had a troop which was much less aggressive, which actually demonstrated much more empathy. Like some of the stuff that he talks about with regards to this troop was that they demonstrated basically a greater, more of those sort of like less turny and more monogamous style traits in terms of you had males come in who were socialized into acting in a less violent manner, and the troop was actually a less territorially aggressive as compared to what it was before. So I suppose aspects of this, there might be enough variability within the baboon genome as it already exists, and also within the ability of the baboons to be socialized, that they could adapt and have been shown to adapt with changing circumstances. Although once again, I don't think this is just purely a baboon thing. I think something similar has been recorded with chimpanzee studies. Simon, you have something to say?
Oh yeah, I was just thinking about the evolutionary backing that I was reading about ages ago. You know how you get like little snippets? As you were discussing about the baboons and how they've become too unique and whatnot, I think baboons have actually got an inbuilt like evolutionary thing to actually have a really quick turnaround when it comes to changing the genetic code, in the respect that when a new alpha is established, they usually just get rid of everything from the previous one. And a lot of female mammal females, weirdly, also, I think by some mammals, I'm really fucking this up probably. They actually have a chemical ability to abort their own children. So that was a fun little thing, but I'm pretty sure there was a couple of monkeys, I don't know if it was specific baboons or chimps, that actually had the similar ability that females, when there is actually a change in leadership, can actually, stop putting resources into children they are trying to gestate. Anyway, Tim, you had something to say?
Yeah, so actually I think that's mainly with deers and a few other types of turney-style species where, the female will abort a fetus from another male if a new dominant alpha male takes control of the harem. Interestingly, I don't believe that is the case with primates, but what it does encourage, and we see this with gorillas, yet another turney-style species, that if you have a child, like a monkey baby who is to another monkey alpha, one of the first things that a new alpha in a troop will do is that they will systematically commit infanticide. So they will attempt to destroy the previous progeny because there's no purpose for them to continue these these child monkey or baboon or gorilla or ape baby's existence, evolutionary speaking, for that male. And the interesting thing as well is that that is once again for the alpha a positive, because once they've killed the baby, the female goes back into their breeding cycle. So they're able to once again spread their genetic material. Interestingly enough, obviously, the females want to keep the babies alive because they have a genetic investment in keeping the baby alive. And so that if you see this kind of infanticide acts going on, it's actually pretty terrifying and traumatic thing for the female, and obviously for anybody who's watching it and has empathy for the monkey babies and the monkey females. Now, I did actually just want to touch on one thing, but I'll throw to Sam first, which is about some of the interesting side effects from the monogamy side. But first, Sam?
I think, Simon, the effect you were talking about is called the Bruce effect. A terrible effect for all Bruces to have their name after, but the spontaneous abortion upon exposure to a different male is called the Bruce effect. It happens in quite a few species. I was vaguely going to talk, I was hoping more have a conversation instead of me just rant, about how incredibly useless we are by comparison, males this is, as, the aggressive, or, whatever, gender in humans. So, the sexual dimorphism, which is where there's sexual differences between genders beyond just the genitalia. And, if you take a look at the sexual dimorphism in humans, whilst compared to, say, a human female, the average male is drastically stronger. But compared to just about every other species that has a large degree of sexual dimorphism, we're actually on the bottom tier. So I'm just going to briefly talk about spiders, a long way away from us. But, the female spider in this instance is often, 10 to 20 times the size of the male spider. Imagine this type of situation where, a male human is 15 foot tall and a female is 3. Yeah, it would just be ridiculous. We're incredibly comparable. I think there's half a foot in height difference between the genders, that kind of stuff. If you look at sea mammals, whatever they're called, things like elephant seals, the male is gargantuan compared to the females. And I think this ties into the tourney breeding you were talking about, Tim. But even in species where that's not necessarily true, it is still we're pretty pathetic. And I think that's because we haven't had the evolutionary selectors to require it, because, we can make pointy sticks and the like. But it's just interesting to think how different society could be if we had a better killing machine for males. Tim?
Yeah, so I think, harkening back to what I was saying, so the male-female difference in sexual dimorphism for humans, when you compare us within our own subset of primates, even then is pretty insignificant compared to baboons, compared to gorillas and a few other Tony-style species. But we are nowhere near as similar to, for instance, the owl monkey, which is extremely monogamous and basically demonstrates no real physiological difference besides genitalia. So I think that definitely we do sit somewhere on the spectrum in terms of for primates between terny and monogamous species. But at the same time, I would definitely say that although this is a driver within our psychology, that the instinctive lizard brain driver is only one aspect in terms of behavior and how behavior is formed. Which I think Simon probably have something to say a bit later on. But back to you.
Yeah, it ties in really interesting if you think about the history of monogamy in humans. So we, evolutionary speaking, we're actually incredibly recently monogamous, they think, based on genetic studies. Because you kind of see when the large influence of individual males, they're having the 8 or 9 wives type thing, which is effectively tourney style breeding practices. It's probably only 20 to 10,000 years old. So it's about the time we stopped being nomadic and started becoming sedentary that monogamy came about, which is probably because when you get a large group of young men that have no chance of passing on their genetic material in a close-knit environment that is stationary, it leads to issues, which I imagine is why it has come about. But that could have led to a decline in sexual dimorphism. So I wonder if we could compare humans physiologically. I haven't looked at this, I didn't even consider it. The skeletons of males from 10,000 years ago, if we can find them, compared to females from 10,000 years ago and what the difference would be. We'll get to you in a second, Tim. I know based off bone structures, we've actually been seeing it drop probably from about the last 10,000 years-ish in what we would consider classical testosterone-driven bone structures. So from the, I think it was as in like ancient Greece time, the women were much bulkier, much stronger. So it could be both sexes actually have moved towards each other or some such. I'll go with Tim first.
Yeah, so I suppose maybe that's a secondary driver, though, in terms of the requirement for more robust physiologies is reducing in line with increase in our sedentary and more technologically driven lives, as opposed to some sort of change in our sexual habits. One thing I did want to actually point out, though, which I was going to talk about with regards to monogamy, is interesting that it has some interesting second order effects which often aren't considered. So with the owl monkeys that I was talking about, so yes, they're monogamous, and a lot of people are like, oh, look at these beautiful monogamous monkeys. They're so beautiful and happy together. For females, with in a monogamous species like monkeys, it actually encourages cuckoldry, because the thing is once you have a child monkey, which is, healthy and strong or whatever, and you can hand it off to the male monkey to do the care for, it actually encourages you to then go get pregnant from another male to increase your genetic stock and to the spread of your genes. So it's interesting that, the second order effects that can actually fall out of some of these evolutionary paths that different species take. I think Simon had something to say.
I always sometimes feel a bit awkward after, you guys discussing the specifics of, cuckoldry and all this fun stuff. And I'm just like, what it reminds me of when you said, they all stand together, how, there's the Slav squat is actually got, a bone structure difference. I'm like, oh, wow, cool, ha 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 ha. Yeah, that's all I really had was that, there's the bone difference. The particular areas have particular bone densities, which just make them better because of, obviously, the sedentary life. Means that, particular traits that were beneficial occurred. But yeah, I just thought that was fun. I know it's a side tangent, but yes, anyway, back to Sam.
God bless you, Simon. God bless you. I wonder, Tim, do you happen to know about, strange question, menstruation in owl monkeys? Because I know in a lot of mammals, the frequency is much lower. Once to twice a year type thing, and I'm wondering if you know the frequency of the owl monkeys, because that would result in changes. So say in male society, right, female ovulate approximately every 20 to 30-ish days. So in order to assure that a child is yours, you have to be constantly present, because if you wander off, who knows? Well, now we've got genetic testing. Eat shit, evolution. But I wonder if that's also occurred in the owl monkeys. Any knowledge?
So apparently the ovarian cycle lasts about 16 days, and menstruation does not occur in female owl monkeys. Mating occurs very infrequently both in the wild and in captivity, and seem to be timed with ovulation. So yeah, there's that.
So they ovulate every 16 days type thing, or the period lasts for only 16 days when they are ovulating?
Apparently in captivity, births occur year-round, but in the wild it can be timed with the rainy season. So it's kind of, it's dependent upon the environmental characteristics.
Okay. There's speculation that it is in human females. Human females. Jesus, I sound like a Wikipedia article. Human females as well, and that in a, I'm going to say outside of captivity, no, ovulation would occur much less frequently. Interesting. Simon, take us away from ovulation.
Yay! Finally, it's back to me, and I get to fall into an area that I'm somewhat done some research in. Okay, so to step away from the biology and ovulation, all this jazz, I'm going to discuss how violence in males has been socially associated and how over time it's actually been slightly disproven, specifically with female imprisonment rates. So back in, I was reading a thing, and a lot of this articles happens from like 1992 is when they actually start noticing that there's an increase in women going to jail. But there's a lot of speculation that early on, a lot of women were not seen to be able to control their actions. Most people have heard about this hysteria, that this is the reason why women used to do anything. And as such, a lot of violent crimes caused by women were just part away, as if, they were just, they had their mood and obviously they killed somebody, but, it's not their fault. But anyway.
Oh my, I've got a case of the vapors.
Yes. Case the vapors. Recent studies have noticed that there's been this increase in females going into incarceration, specifically for violent crimes, which was for a while just associated with males, that males, because their testosterone, would be committing violent crimes, whereas women were impossibly able to commit violent crimes. However, with a 3% increase in women being incarcerated in Queensland, yep, I'm using a Australian statistic, if there's a genuine increase each year in the number of people being put in incarceration that are female. However, to extend this whole idea of the social element, this is also affected by race. So an interesting little fact I found is that Aboriginal women are more likely to be incarcerated than white males, which is just ridiculous because... Anyway, yes, Sam, you wanted to say something?
So my wife has worked a little bit with this, and if you compare crime for crime, it's disproportionately, I think, stricter punishment rather than likelihood to commit a crime. If you look at conviction rates rather than imprisonment rates, it becomes a lot more... It's still disproportionate, but again, this could be, we have a systemic issue where certain subsets of our society are more likely to be punished or found guilty for actions than others. But yeah, I guess historically that could have been men as well for violent crimes, or currently men for violent crimes. So this increase in female violence could be, like you were saying, more of a normalization.
Yeah. I know I've jumped over a bunch of things, and there's that whole entire element that there's a systemic issue. But what I'm discussing is more along the line. But as you discussed, it could just be that men are being seen as this thing. But yes. I'm just rambling now. Tim, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, I suppose it was just a question, and I think riffing off what Sam's already talked about. So we acknowledge that systemic, historical, racial and governance issues can result in increased incarceration rates and increased offence rates. So poverty and socioeconomic circumstance can dramatically impact someone's life outcomes, but also the kinds of choices that, one, are available to them, and two, that they're going to take throughout their life. Something I'd like to throw to the two of you as a question. So if the archetype of a woman, historically speaking, was not violent and was seen in a sort of diametric opposition to the masculine, and this is playing into that gender role as opposed to sexual biology piece here, do you think that as that gender role of the female as subservient, pacifist, I mean, if you look at the first generation of suffragettes, one of their big arguments for female participation in democracy was that women would provide a pacifist and softening touch that would counter the more aggressive and warlike nature of men. Do you think that potentially that is an aspect of increasing female incarceration rates, that, as Sam has said, we're actually seeing a return to, or a turn to, a more natural, quote-unquote, level of female violence?
Okay, in response to that, I am going to... Okay, I'm not even bothered putting that reference in, because the reference is a reference of a reference from, I think it's 1970, 1980, which is discussed specifically... As with all academics, they love to discuss what's topical, and they were discussing this movement into increase the thing, and you know what they labeled it on? Feminism. And the reason why is because more women were actually out and about, and because women were out and about, they had access to be able to kill people. But they thought it was feminism that was encouraging them to, murder and, to bash up each other, and that is the answer to your question of whether or not you think it's a normalization or whether it's, just that they're out and about. and out and about is the answer so far. Anyway, I feel like I completely missed your question, but Tim, do you want to rehash if I've missed anything?
No, I mean, like, that's a valid potential question, is that answer, that if women are more participating in day-to-day society, and that's all aspects of society, including the kinds of events that result in intrapersonal violence, then maybe a greater participation in broader society is actually what's resulting in them committing more violence rather than any more inherent violent nature for men or women. And I suppose that would kind of be answering the question in that sense as well, rather than some sort of argument that a degradation of traditional female roles has led to them turning towards a different point. And maybe, once again, as I think Sam was saying with regards to over-criminalisation of Indigenous actions in Australia, maybe for a long time women's violence was excused because of hysteria, etc., etc. Sam, you got something to say?
Yeah, I wonder if the increase in female violence as such coincides with. I wanted to say, maybe I'm wrong. No, it's the feminists who are wrong. Yeah, sorry. With the decline as such of Mother's Little Helper, So obviously diazepam, massively overprescribed in Anglo societies in the 1950s and 60s. You then have people going, holy shit, we probably shouldn't just be sedating half the population constantly. And so maybe, pre-drugging half the population so they could put up with the banality of being a enforced domicile slave as such. All of a sudden you got a whole bunch of people reverting back to more normalish behaviors that could have happened, say, in the 1800s or the 1910s. Do you know if you have data on that, Simon?
Specifically on the relationship between the drugs versus thing, there's the only thing I've found close to it is modern women compared to Anglo-Saxon and Norman women, like the stories of them and sort of bringing the similarities between them, focusing specifically a lot on female culture and in the Scandinavian areas and this sort of discussion. There's not too much about the stop in drugging, unfortunately. They sort of gloss over a lot of those. I don't know why there's not a lot that I can find. Do keep in mind I've lost access to about 80% of my resources because I don't have the university paying for all my research. But, that is what it is, unfortunately. Tim, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I was going to say for Sam is that I think you'd actually find in the 1800s that those rates probably wouldn't go down too much because of opium use. Laudanum and opium sort of filled that same role. And I mean, opiates today fill the same sort of role in terms of Mother's Little Helper, and I suppose as an escapism and a sedition or sedation, I say, not sedition. They're not very seditious if you're a housewife in a drugged up mood.
I've obviously never met a housewife.
Yeah, exactly. But one thing I'd say as well is that I think that when you start getting to the 1700s, that's when you actually start seeing the emergence of the bourgeois middle class and the development of feminism in reaction to the development of essentially this domicile class. So realistically, it's really with the middle class and the fact that you then have women who can afford, as in their families can afford to completely segregate them and treat them as nothing but domicile slaves, that the modern feminist movement really sort of emerges in reaction to that. I mean, aristocratic women have always lived different lives. You can look at, for instance, French or British aristocracy. Like the life of an aristocratic woman is obviously limited in terms of compared to their male counterparts, but it was much more broad in terms of that they could travel, they could write, and they could involve themselves in intellectual activities, surprisingly. Whereas for peasant women and for working, well, there wasn't really a working class before industrialization, but for agricultural classes, women were labor. You couldn't afford to not have them in the fields. So back to you, Sam.
Yeah, it was just as you were saying that, I was thinking, okay, like societal tropes or cliches or stereotypes, whatever, often, have a grain of origin in them. And so I was thinking, the fishmonger's wife. It's this huge burly woman with, arms like legs of ham that beats the ever-living cunt out of her husband. Because working class woman or, low socioeconomic woman expected to still contribute more at home and at work, which means they can't be this subjugated. Well, that's still incorrect. They were still subjugated, but not in the same manner. And so maybe, that's why the concept of lower class women being violent was always prevalent throughout the tropes. Yeah, interesting. Simon?
I also found it interesting in relation to the fishmonger's wife thing. That was also around the same time that children weren't seen as children. Children were seen as small adults, so they had to still fulfill all the roles of an adult. They were just smaller. And I like to see that sort of thing where everything was based, well, it still is based off the inverted commas normal, which is, straight white male. So it's just this normal of, male, and everybody's just a different variant of that. And it's just the lower the social economic, the more it's supposed to be like this sameness between all members of the family cohort. So yeah, I feel like, it's very interesting seeing this, the people that can't be this docile thing. It's sort of, they have to be like a pseudo male, I guess, in that sort of relationship. Anyway, Tim.
Well, I was just going to say, gentlemen, thank you for a very interesting discussion, but I think we're out of time. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in again, and we hope you tune in again next time.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.